Hello and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where I shall be picking up part 2 of the life of Michelangelo Buonarroti after the interruption of that great episode with Apostolic Majesty all about Russia and Ukraine. So we'll pick up the life of Michelangelo. I left off last time where we talked about the David. So Michelangelo's sort of in his late 20s. So I'll pick up the story. This will have to be a 3-parter at least. And in this episode, I hope to get through at least the first part of the story of the tomb of Pope Julius II, as well as the painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and maybe couple other bits and bobs, maybe when Rome and Florence came under siege. So with no further ado, I'll jump straight in. We're using the life of Vasari, and I shall be doing quite a lot of reading in this one. So he tells us, carrying on the story of the David. Vasari says, quote, "The David, for which Piero Soderini paid Michelangelo 400 crowns, was put in position in the year 1504. It established Michelangelo's reputation as a sculptor, and he went on to make the Gonfaloniere a very fine David in bronze, which Soderini sent to France. At this time, Michelangelo also blocked out, without ever finishing, 2 marble roundels, one for Taddeo Taddei, which is to be found in his house today, and the other for Bartolomeo Pitti." The Pitti family is one of the other main families of Florence. "These works were highly admired and appreciated. In addition, Michelangelo blocked out in the Office of Works of Santa Maria del Fiore a marble statue of St. Matthew. Rough as it is, this is a perfect work of art which serves to teach other sculptors how to carve a statue out of marble without making any mistakes, perfecting the figure gradually by removing the stone judiciously and being able to alter what has been done. Michelangelo also made a bronze Tondo of Our Lady, which he cast at the request of certain Flemish merchants of the Muscron family, men of great distinction in their own country, who paid him 100 crowns and sent the work to Bruges. Then Angelo Doni, a Florentine who loved to own beautiful things by ancient or modern artists, decided he would like his friend to make something for him. So Michelangelo started work on a round painting of the Madonna. That still survives, so I'll put pictures of that up. This picture shows Our Lady kneeling down and holding out the child to St. Joseph. The Mother of Christ turns her head and gazes intently on the supreme beauty of her Son, and an air of marvellous contentment lovingly shared with the venerable St. Joseph, and who takes the child with similar affection, tenderness and reverence, as we can see from a glance at his face. Not content with this achievement, to show his superb mastery of painting, Michelangelo depicted in the background several nude figures, some leaning, others standing and seated. He executed this work with such care and diligence that it is held beyond doubt as the most beautiful and perfect of the few panel pictures he painted." So panel pictures painted on a bit of wood. Michelangelo didn't do many of those. As I said before, he didn't really consider himself a painter first and foremost. He thought of, as a lot of people did, he thought of painting as sort of a craftsman's job. It wasn't the work of a true genius. He wanted to do sculpting. He considered himself a sculptor first and foremost, and just sort of a great thinker and an architect. Painting wasn't top of his list by any stretch of the imagination. Vasari goes on, "When it was ready, he sent it under wrappings to Angelo's house with a note asking for payment of 70 ducats. When Angelo, who was careful with his money, was disconcerted at being asked to spend so much on a picture, even though he knew that in fact it was worth even more, he gave the messenger 40 ducats and told him that that was enough. Whereupon Michelangelo returned the money with a message to say that Angelo should send back either 100 ducats or the picture itself. Then Angelo, who liked the painting, said, 'Well, I'll give him 70. However, Michelangelo was still far from satisfied. Bit like Achilles here, you've annoyed him, so he's going to remain annoyed at you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Michelangelo was still far from satisfied. Indeed, because of Angelo's breach of faith, he demanded double what he had asked for first of all. And this meant that to get the picture, Angelo was having to pay 140 ducats. It happened that while the great painter Leonardo da Vinci was working in the council chamber, this is in Florence, Piero Soderini, who was sort of the leader of Florence during this time. The Medici had been ousted and Florence had gone back to a republic. That's what the David came to symbolise, really. It's a great republican piece of art in a way. I suppose in that story, in that metaphor, in that analogy, the Medici would be the Goliath. So anyway, in this period, Florence had returned to be a republic, and yet even in republics you get great men. They might not be the king or the duke or anything, but they're still sort of preeminent. And Soderini, the Gonfaloniere, was that at this point. Piero Soderini, who was then Gonfaloniere, recognised Michelangelo's abilities, had part of the hall allocated to him, and this was why Michelangelo painted the other wall in competition with Leonardo, taking as his subject an episode in the Pisan War, when Florence fought Pisa. For this project, Michelangelo used a room in the Dryers Hospital at St. Onofrio, where he started work on a vast cartoon which he refused to let anyone see. Michelangelo did that most of his career. He didn't want people to see what he was working on until he was finished, which annoyed nearly everyone. He filled it with naked men who are bathing because of the heat in the River Arno, when suddenly, upon an attack by the enemy, the alarm is raised in the camp. And as the soldiers rush out of the water to dress themselves, Michelangelo's inspired hand depicted some hurrying to arm themselves in order to bring help to their comrades, others buckling on their cuirasses, many fastening other pieces of armour on their bodies, and countless more dashing into the fray on horseback. Among the rest was the figure of an old man wearing a garland of ivy to shade his head. He is sitting down to pull on his stockings, but he cannot do so because his legs are wet from the water. And as he hears the cries and tumult of the soldiers and the beating of the drums, he is straining to draw on one stocking by force. The nerves and muscles of his face and his contorted mouth convey the frenzied effort and exertion he is making with his whole body. There were some drummers and other naked figures with their clothes bundled up, hurrying to get to the fighting, and drawn in various unusual attitudes, some upright, some kneeling, or leaning forward, or halfway between one position and another, all exhibiting the most difficult foreshortenings. So I said before about Michelangelo, a lot of the artists, including Leonardo, it's one thing to be able to to be a good draftsman, i.e. to be good at drawing, when you're doing a face that's straight on or in profile, or even at sort of 3/4 or something. It's a whole other thing to depict people and animals and things when they're in a strange pose, when they're in an odd, difficult, weird pose, to do that realistically, to pull that off and it not look stupid or crap. That's much, much, much more difficult. And then there's this idea of foreshortening. Like it's to do with perspective. If you like see my hand, that's one thing. But if I'm to point it at you, to draw that, the foreshortening of things, that again is much, much, much more difficult. And in the Renaissance, foreshortening was a thing that people started to master, really. People like Michelangelo are among, not the first, but they're people that sort of brought the art of foreshortening to sort of a new peak, a new level. Michelangelo was certainly one of the best to ever do it. Again, it's just much, much more difficult to paint a sort of a foreshortened arm. That's much, much more difficult. And especially if you don't have to, right? It's nearly always up to the artists, or certainly the great artists, people like Michelangelo. It was nearly always up to them to design the picture, to come up with the composition. So you don't have to give yourself the headache of rendering foreshortened limbs all the time. But Michelangelo did. And everyone agreed, or still does agree, that he always did it brilliantly. There were also many groups of figures drawn in different ways, some outlined in charcoal, others sketched with a few strokes, some shaded gradually and heightened with lead white, this Michelangelo did to show how much he knew about his craft. Also, a lot of it is sort of deliberately showing off. All the great artists, particularly Leonardo and Michelangelo, were in competition with each other in a very real sense. You've got to prove you're the best around. So you give yourself difficult tasks. Both Leonardo and Michelangelo did that over and over again. Vasari goes on, when they saw the cartoon, all the other artists were overcome with admiration and astonishment, for it was a revelation of the perfection that the art of painting could reach. People who have seen these inspired figures declared that they have never been surpassed by Michelangelo or by anyone else, and that no one can ever again reach such sublime heights. And this may readily be believed, for after the cartoon had been finished, and to the glory of Michelangelo, carried to the Sala del Papa with tremendous acclamations from all the artists, those who subsequently studied it and made copies of the figure, as was done for many years in Florence by local artists and others, became excellent painters themselves. That's a very convoluted sentence there, but basically Vasari is telling us that there were so many new and great techniques in this particular painting that for decades and centuries after, lots and lots of great artists from Florence and from wider Italy would go there to see it and use it as an example of how to do it, how to do foreshortening well, all sorts of different techniques were used in that particular painting. Vasari continues, the cartoon, having thus become a school for craftsmen, it was taken to the great upper room of the House of the Medici, but this meant that it was unwisely left in the hands of the craftsmen, and when Duke Giuliano fell ill, without warning, it was torn into pieces. There's still lots of it survives. And now it is dispersed in various places. For example, there are some fragments still to be seen at Mantua in the house of Uberto Strozzi, a Mantuan gentleman who preserves them with great reverence, and certainly anyone who sees them is inclined to think them of divine rather than human origin. Michelangelo had become so famous because of his Pietà, the colossal statue of David at Florence, and the cartoon, that when in 1503 Alexander VI died and Julius II was elected Pope, at which time Buonarroti was about 29 years old, Julius very graciously summoned him to Rome to build his tomb, and to meet the expenses of the journey, he was paid 100 crowns by the Pope's agent. Got to say straight away a word or two about Pope Julius II. It's up for debate which were the greatest, and what does that even mean, but which was the greatest medieval or Renaissance Pope. Julius II's got a good shout for it. Great in terms of just important and interesting, not great as in sort of nice. Pope Julius II is often described as imperious. He wielded power like few other popes. He knew his own mind. Let's put it that way. He bullied everyone around him successfully. There's some people that are good at wielding power and others that aren't. It's a balancing act. You can be too harsh, too extreme. You end up getting yourself murdered or deposed. Or you can be too weak and lax and get yourself ignored and or murdered and deposed. Or you can play the game sort of kind of perfectly with a firm hand. Well, that's Julius. No one really ever bullied Michelangelo apart from Julius. I mean, the great art historian Kenneth Clark, the Lord Kenneth Clark, the old one, not the modern one, he said that Julius basically bullied his way through life, through the world. And anyway, once he became Pope, this Julius II, a few other popes, and that's saying something for sort of the 15th, 16th century, a few other popes were able to sort of, really, really wield power with such ferocity, and successfully though. So that's Julius II, a bull among men. But Julius II was reasonably old even when he became Pope. And so he wanted to start work on his own tomb straight away. And already Michelangelo is thought of as possibly the greatest artist in sort of the known world, in the Western world. And certainly the greatest sculptor as well. So it was sort of a no-brainer for Julius II. I want Michelangelo Buonarroti, the famous Florentine, to make my tomb. Now, a bit of a spoiler alert, because I'm going to talk about this tomb quite a lot. But the long and short of it is that it took a ridiculously long time. Well, 40 years, something like 40 years before Michelangelo finished it. And the whole thing was just a massive, massive saga. It just goes on and on and on. And the final thing, it went through many different versions. There are many different reworkings from the original plan. But ultimately, there is a tomb of Julius II by Michelangelo, but it's not what they originally wanted. It's not what Michelangelo originally envisioned at all. But I'll go on here. Vasari tells us, after he, Michelangelo, had arrived in Rome, however, many months were let go by before he was asked to do any work. See, Julius II was like that. First of all, you don't say no to the Pope, kind of ever. Whoever the Pope is, sort of, nobody really says no if he asks you to do something. If he's going to pay you to do something, you don't say no to the Pope, right? But then, throw on top of that a Pope like Julius II, you certainly don't say no. But then he just kept Michelangelo waiting. Again, the most famous artist in the world, perhaps. Just kept him waiting for months. They lock horns a bit, Michelangelo and Julius II. Because Michelangelo was one of those people, like a lot of perhaps temperamental artists. Within reason, he's going to do and say what he wants and behave how he wants, even in the face of a badass Pope like Julius II. So they locked horns a bit, but they basically ended up on good terms. But I'll let Vasari continue. But eventually the Pope chose for his tomb the design made by Michelangelo. This design was an eloquent proof of Michelangelo's genius, for in beauty and magnificence, wealth of ornamentation, and richness of sanctity, it surpassed every ancient or imperial tomb ever made. When he saw it, Pope Julius grew more ambitious and resolved to set about rebuilding the Church of St. Peter's at Rome and to raise his tomb inside. So that's a massive thing. Nowadays, if you go to Rome, there's St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican City, right? It's all there. It's that massive, massive church, basically, with the giant famous dome on top of it. Now, that was built over many, many decades that started by Julius II and finished many popes later. But before that was there was another St. Peter's, Church of St. Peter's. Or was it a cathedral? Anyway, there was another massive building there, very ancient, venerable, the seat of the popes. Julius decides to tear it down. Again, the art historian, Lord Clark, said that whenever he thinks of that, it makes him queasy. You know, it's like a bit like maybe someone decides they're going to tear down the Houses of Parliament and build a new one. Or they're going to tear down the White House or the Capitol building. They're going to tear that down and build a new one. I mean, it's bold. Again, that speaks of the type of person Julius II was. Unbelievably bold. So anyway, that's what they did. And his idea that inside the new St. Peter's, if you've ever been in there, I've been in there a few times, it's a giant, giant open space, like a lot of big cathedrals. The space inside is, like an aircraft hangar, big, giant. St. Peter's particularly. And anyway, Julius's idea was that inside St. Peter's would be his tomb, which itself would be the size of a building. The size of a house or something, a bit bigger than a house, something on that scale. it still easily fit inside the giant St. Peter's Basilica. So that was his first idea. It never ends up happening. I'll let Vasari continue. He says, quote, "So Michelangelo started work with very high hopes." Oh yeah, between them, they kept egging each other on in the first instance. Oh, we'll build it like this. We'll build it bigger and better. We'll have even more statues on it. 40 in total they wanted. And they just kept sort of egging each other on in the initial design process until basically they came up with something that was sort of unlikely to ever get finished or done. So Vasari says, "So Michelangelo started work with very high hopes. He had the full backing of Julius II. Going first of all with two of his assistants to Carrara, a very, very famous marble quarry, perhaps the best marble quarry in the world, even to this day. He went to Carrara to excavate all the marble, on account of which he received 1,000 crowns. He had nothing more by way of money or supplies for the 8 months he spent in the mountains at the quarry, where, inspired by the masses of stone, he conceived many fantastic ideas for carving giant statues in the quarries in order to leave there a memorial of himself, as the ancients had done." Wait, he spent 8 months at Carrara just looking at bits of marble and getting workmen to cut them out. 8 months? That's sort of crazy. There's a bit here where I said Vasari doesn't always mention everything that might be a bit embarrassing or a bit detrimental to the story of Michelangelo, because Vasari was a great sycophant of Michelangelo. Many have said, historians that don't owe the Medici or Michelangelo anything, some historians have said Michelangelo sort of not wasting time deliberately there, but he could have done it quicker. He didn't have to spend 8 months necessarily. But Michelangelo seems to have had a love affair with marble. Like really, really loved everything about it. Really loved everything about the process of quarrying it and moving it. To move these giant, many tons blocks of marble, you sometimes often have to sort of build a whole road to get it where you wanted it to end up. The engineering of that, the logistics of that. Build new machines and techniques for moving it. Michelangelo was interested in all of that. So there you go. And, you know, if you can draw a job out, especially if you think your patron, the Pope, has effectively got endless money, if you can draw a job out and keep asking for more money, you know, that's a way of enriching yourself in some sense. Anyway, 8 months does seem excessive to me, and it hasn't been lost on others that is quite a long time to do that. After he had chosen all the marble that was wanted, he had it loaded on board ship and taken to Rome, where the blocks filled half of the square of St. Peter's around Santa Caterina and between the church and the corridor leading to Castel St. Angelo. In the castle of Castel St. Angelo, Michelangelo had prepared his room for executing the figures and the rest of the tomb, and so that he could come and see him at work without any bother, the Pope had ordered a drawbridge to be built from the corridor to the room. This led to great intimacy between them. They became friends on some level, although it's definitely sort of a master-employee relationship. Although in time, the favours he, Michelangelo, was shown brought Michelangelo considerable annoyance and even persecution, and stirred up much envy among his fellow craftsmen. Of this work, Michelangelo executed during the lifetime and after the death of Julius 4 statues completed and 8 which were only blocked out. Again, the original thing was going to be 40 plus. Would have taken Michelangelo his whole life. Since the design of the tomb illustrates Michelangelo's extraordinary powers of invention, we shall describe here the plan that he followed. To give a sense of grandeur, he intended the tomb to be freestanding so as to be seen from all 4 sides. The sides measured 24 feet in one direction and 36 in the other, the dimensions therefore being a square and a half. All around the outer side of the tomb were a range of niches, divided one from the other by terminal figures. clothed from the middle upwards, which supported the first cornice with their heads, and each of these figures had fettered to it, in a strange and curious attitude, a nude captive standing on a projection of the base. These captives were meant to represent all the provinces subjugated by the Pope and made obedient by the Apostolic Church. And there were various other statues, also fettered, of all the liberal arts and sciences, which were thus shown to be subject to death no less than the pontiff himself, who employed them so honourably. On the corners of the first cornice, fucking hell. On the corners of the first cornice were to go 4 large figures representing the active and the contemplative life, St. Paul and Moses. The tomb rose above the cornice in gradually diminishing steps, with a decorated bronze frieze, and with other figures, putti, and ornaments all around. At the summit, completing the structure, were 2 figures, one of which was Heaven, an anthropomorphized human figure representing heaven, smiling and supporting a bier on her shoulder, and the other, Cybele, the goddess of earth, who appeared to be grief-stricken at having to remain in a world robbed of all the virtue through the death of such a great man, in contrast to Heaven, who is shown rejoicing that his soul had passed to celestial glory. The tomb was arranged so that one might enter and come out between the niches at the end of the quadrangle, and the interior was in the shape of an oval, curving like a temple. The sarcophagus to take the Pope's dead body was to be in the middle. Finally, the tomb was to have 40 marble statues, not to mention the other scenes, putti, and ornamentation, and the richly carved cornices and other architectural elements. To hurry the work on, Michelangelo arranged that some of the marble should be taken to Florence, where he intended at times to pass the summer in order to avoid the malaria of Rome. And there he executed one side of the work in several sections down to the last detail. With his own hand, he finished in Rome 2 of the captives, which were truly inspired, and other statues which have never been surpassed. As they were never used for the tomb, these captives were given by Michelangelo to Roberto Strozzi when he happened to be lying ill in his house. Subsequently, they were sent as a gift to King Francis, and they are now in Epochs in France. In Rome, he also blocked out 8 statues, and in Florence another 5, along with a Victory surmounting the figures of a captive, which are now in the possession of Duke Cosimo, to whom they were given by Michelangelo's nephew, Leonardo. His Excellency has put the Victory in the great hall of his palace, which was painted by Vasari, the author. He's referring to himself in the third person. Michelangelo also finished the Moses, again considered one of the greatest sculptures, this Moses. For some reason, it's got horns. Well, not for some reason. The reason for that is, looks like a satyr or something. Why has Moses got like little horns? Just to say on that, we're used to the King James translation of the Bible, or you might have a much newer version, Good News version of the Bible. Anyway, King James is obviously English and a little bit after this. Back in the sort of late 15th century, early 16th century in Italy, they had another translation, and at some point, it seems to be a mistranslation. It's mentioned that Moses has horns in some way. So that's how Michelangelo depicted him, but we don't really read that version of the Bible anymore. So it is a little bit odd that the figure of Moses has got these little kind of satyr horns. Vasari goes on, Michelangelo also finished the Moses, a beautiful statue in marble 10 feet high. With this, no other modern art will ever bear comparison, nor indeed do the statues of the ancient world. For, seated in an attitude of great dignity, Moses rests one arm on the tablets that he is grasping in one hand, while with the other he is holding his beard, which falls in long ringlets and is carved in the marble so finely that the hairs, extremely difficult for the sculptor to represent, are downy and soft and so detailed that it seems that Michelangelo must have exchanged his chisel for a brush.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.